Okay, so today we're diving into a really heavy topic. Trying to understand Jeffrey Dahmer, not just as the monster everyone knows him as, but, try to understand him as a human being.
It's definitely going to be complex, that's for sure. A lot of disturbing details, and really makes you think about the darkness that can exist, within all of us.
Yeah. And for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the case, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer active in the late 70s and 80s. He confessed to 17 murders, young men.
Yeah, and not just the murders themselves, the brutality, the necrophilia, cannibalism, even these attempts to create living zombies.
Right, and that's what we're going to try to unpack today. We'll look at his childhood, try to see if there were early signs of trouble, and how those dark fantasies might have developed, and ultimately what led to that first kill in 78.
Yeah, and as we go through all this, it's going to be important to consider all the missed opportunities to intervene, right?
Right.
The ways society might have failed and allowed him to continue for so long.
Exactly. So let's start with Dahmer's childhood. Some accounts describe him as, seemingly normal, just a typical middle-class family. But like anything, if you look closer, you start to see some cracks.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Even in those early years, there were signs. A fascination with the insides of animals, really preferring things over people, and just a real inability to connect with others.
With some kind of fundamental disconnect,
Yeah.
just not being able to relate to others on an emotional level. And then there's that story about the childhood hernia operation. That seemed to really affect him.
Yeah, Dahmer himself talked about how anxious and scared he was about that surgery, and it seems to have created this unhealthy focus on the body, like less about the person and more about the mechanics of it all, flesh and bone.
It's almost like that surgery, having his body cut open, sparked this fascination with the insides of living things, but in a really detached, almost clinical way.
That's a great point. It's like it took away any sense of, I don't know, vulnerability, empathy, and replaced it with this cold curiosity about anatomy and this need to control, I guess, the physical form.
And speaking of control, there's that really chilling detail about a game he played with a friend as a kid, like pretend strangulation.
Yeah.
Looking back, it feels like a pretty clear foreshadowing of what was to come.
It's definitely disturbing. Speaks to this early fascination with power, right? Being able to control someone's life makes you wonder, were those impulses always there, just waiting to come out?
Yeah, impossible to know for sure, but brings up that whole nature versus nurture debate. Was he always going to be violent, or did his environment shape him that way?
It's probably always a mix of things, never just one thing that causes these kinds of situations. But that incident and some of his other behaviors as a kid, it's not a great picture. Like his mind was already grappling with something dark, even before he could understand it himself.
Right. And then there's the family dynamic to consider. His parents' relationship was volatile, lots of arguments, tension. Then, when he was about 14, his mother left, took his younger brother with her.
I mean, abandonment like that has got to be devastating. Adolescence is already tough emotionally, and for Dahmer, who already had trouble connecting with people, that loss must have been catastrophic.
Yeah, it's like all that isolation he felt, feeling inadequate, anger, it all got amplified when his mom left. He's alone, unwanted, in a world that probably already felt pretty hostile.
And that's when the drinking starts to get worse, right? It becomes a coping mechanism for all the emotional turmoil.
Hmm.
Alcohol numbs the pain, lowers those inhibitions, and that might allow those darker impulses to,
Yeah.
gain a foothold.
Yeah, like he was self-medicating, trying to escape reality through alcohol and those disturbing fantasies. And tragically, those fantasies start bleeding into the real world.
Yeah. His early sexual experiences show he wasn't really interested in people, just bodies, like they were objects. It's like he was looking for a connection, but just couldn't experience it in a healthy way.
His necrophilia starts developing around this time, too. And it's important to understand, it wasn't just a morbid interest in corpses. It was about control, eliminating the unpredictability of, human interaction.
That's such a key point. For Dahmer, necrophilia was about having complete power over another being, taking away their agency, silencing them. It was about possessing something he felt he could never have in real life. Total control.
And then those fantasies turn into a horrific reality in 1978 with the murder of Stephen Hicks. Dahmer was just 18.
Yeah, a real turning point, like a point of no return. He lures Hicks, who is hitchhiking, back to his family home, and in this moment of panic and frustration, he kills him.
And the way he describes it later, it's so chilling. totally detached, like he's talking about some science experiment,
Yeah.
talks about dismembering the body, disposing of it, and there's no emotion.
Right. It's like he's compartmentalized the whole thing, separated it from any guilt or remorse, a defense mechanism maybe, trying to cope with what he's done.
And what's even more disturbing, there's a 9-year gap between Hicks and his next victim. It's like he managed to suppress those urges for almost a decade.
That gap is fascinating, isn't it? It suggests he was fighting a battle within himself, his urges versus his control. It makes you wonder what happened in those 9 years that led him to reemerge, even more dangerous than before.
Well, he did enlist in the Army not long after that first murder.
Yeah.
Maybe he thought the structure, the discipline would help him get control.
Almost like he was trying to run from himself, bury those urges in the routine of military life, this desperate attempt to fit in, find a place where he wasn't an outsider.
But it didn't work. He was discharged for alcohol abuse. Even the military couldn't stop those demons.
Right. And after that discharge, things really shift. He comes back to the U.S., probably feeling like a failure, and that failure fuels his urges, pushes him further down that dark path.
Like any hope he had of escaping his demons, whether through the military or even religion, it's shattered. And he's left alone with those dark desires, feeling even more isolated and desperate.
And that desperation, feeling trapped by his own compulsions, that seems to set the stage for the truly horrific escalation of his crimes in the years that follow.
So that brings up a really important question. Could this 9-year gap be the key to understanding why Dahmer became a serial killer? If we can figure out what happened during that time, what he was thinking and feeling, maybe we can gain a deeper understanding of his descent into darkness.
It's definitely a period worth looking into. What triggered him to start killing again? Were there specific events, relationships, internal struggles that pushed him over the edge? These are all questions we need to explore as we go deeper into Dahmer's story.
It's like putting together a puzzle, trying to find the missing pieces that help us see the full picture. Who was Jeffrey Dahmer, and what drove him to do such horrific things?
So we left off with Dahmer back in civilian life after being discharged from the Army, 1981, back in the U.S. Not an easy time, I'm sure, trying to find his place.
He ends up living with his grandmother, right? Seems like that could have offered some stability, reconnect with family, try to rebuild.
And on the surface, it does seem calm. He's going to church with his grandmother, gets a job, tries to maintain some kind of normalcy. But underneath it all, those dark fantasies are still there. And the drinking, it's still a problem.
Almost like he wants to fit into this conventional life, but something's holding him back. This struggle between wanting to be accepted, be normal, but those urges are just too strong to escape.
Exactly. And then in 1986, he's arrested for indecent exposure. Public humiliation, a big sign that he can't hide those urges forever.
A wake-up call, right? That facade he's built is crumbling. But instead of getting help, it seems like he goes even deeper into those destructive behaviors.
Yeah, it's like the arrest, the shame of it all somehow makes those desires even stronger. Like some twisted validation that he's different, doesn't belong in the normal world.
And then, in 1987, he moves to Milwaukee. And that's when things really escalate. He goes from these occasional acts of violence to, well, becoming a full-blown serial killer.
Milwaukee becomes his hunting ground, yeah. The city gives him a sense of anonymity, a place where he can blend in and prey on the most vulnerable, young men on the fringes of society.
And his crimes during this time, they're horrific. The drugging, the torture, the dismemberment, the cannibalism.
Yeah.
It's just hard to even comprehend that level of depravity.
It's the increasing ritualization that's so disturbing. It's not just about satisfying some primal urge anymore. It's about controlling every single step, turning victims into objects he can possess and manipulate, even in death.
He takes pictures, poses them, keeps their remains. It's like he's creating this macabre museum, this testament to his own twisted desires, his power over life and death.
Yeah, this grotesque need for control, trying to impose order on a world that feels chaotic to him, like he's creating his own twisted sense of beauty, reflecting his own messed up view of humanity.
And what's so frustrating, there were so many chances to stop him. Neighbors complain about the smells, the strange noises, run-ins with the police, like that one incident where officers actually returned a drugged boy to his apartment.
Oh, the Connor accent, the Sumpfen case. That's just the worst example of how the system failed, how Dahmer got away with it for so long. It shows how racial bias, homophobia, just a general disregard for those on the margins played a role.
It's unbelievable that the police, who are supposed to protect us, could be manipulated by him so easily. It's about power, assumptions, prejudice. All of it can blind us to the truth.
It's a really harsh reminder that even those in authority can be fooled. And the vulnerable, they're often the least protected. Makes you think about how justice isn't always fair, and those societal biases can have really deadly consequences.
And that incident, you show something about Dahmer, too. His ability to stay calm, charming even, when facing authority, even when his crimes were about to be exposed.
Absolutely. It shows how cunning he was, how manipulative, able to fool those who should have been suspicious. He knew how to play the system, exploit people's trust, and just evade detection.
That ability to blend in, seem harmless, that's how he went undetected for so long. It's terrifying that someone capable of such awful things could walk around unnoticed, hiding that darkness under a mask of normal.
It reminds us that evil can wear many faces and appearances can lie. We have to be vigilant, look for those signs of danger, even in people who seem totally unassuming.
So let's talk about his psychology. The sources mention borderline personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. Could you explain what those are and how they might have played a role?
Okay, so borderline personality disorder, that's marked by instability in relationships, identity, and emotions. People with it are often terrified of being abandoned, impulsive, and they engage in self-destructive behaviors. It's possible that Dahmer's fear of being alone, of losing control, that's what fueled his need to possess and dominate his victims.
So in a way, his crimes were, well, a way of coping with his own inner turmoil, that fear of rejection, of being abandoned.
It's a disturbing thought, but it could be. And then there's schizotypal personality disorder. That's about eccentric thoughts and behaviors, trouble forming close relationships, and a distorted view of reality. People with this disorder might experience paranoia, have unusual beliefs, and have difficulty telling fantasy from reality.
So that could explain his detachment, how he could do those horrific things and compartmentalize them, almost like he was watching from a distance.
Yeah, like there was a mental barrier between him and what he was actually doing. Let him function normally on the outside while also indulging those dark fantasies.
It's chilling to think about how the human mind can compartmentalize things like that. Separate thoughts and actions that seem completely contradictory. Maybe it's a survival mechanism, but one that can be devastating when mixed with those kinds of impulses.
It's important to remember these are just theories, ways to try to understand his mind. But they offer some insight into how those psychological factors could have worked together to lead him down this path.
And of course, these diagnoses don't excuse what he did or lessen the suffering he caused. It just gives us a framework for understanding the mind of a very troubled person.
Right. The goal isn't to absolve him of responsibility, but to explore the factors that shaped him, to try and make sense of the senseless.
And by doing that, maybe we can learn to recognize those warning signs, those little clues that someone's struggling with similar impulses, and maybe even intervene before tragedy strikes.
It's about moving beyond just the shock and horror of his crimes and using what we know to protect others, prevent these things from happening again, turning this dark chapter into something that helps us understand mental health better and the complexities of human behavior.
One of the things that stands out that's really disturbing is his obsession with creating zombies. What did he mean by that? What does it tell us about him?
His attempts to create these living zombies, it was all about control. He wanted a companion that would be completely subservient with no free will, no ability to resist him.
He drilled holes into some of his victims' skulls while they were alive, injected acid or boiling water into their brains. He actually believed he could make them docile, turn them into, like, mindless slaves.
A truly horrific experiment, driven by this delusion that he could rewire the human brain, eliminate someone's individuality, create a being that only existed to fulfill his desires.
Shows a deep-seated fear of rejection, doesn't it? Being terrified of abandonment, of someone disobeying him. He wanted someone who couldn't leave, who couldn't challenge him.
Exactly. It's a chilling example of how his need for control, his inability to connect with people on a real level, led him to do these unthinkable things.
Makes you wonder, if Dahmer had access to modern technology, would he have gone about those zombie experiments differently?
It's a scary thought, but worth considering. With all the advances in neuroscience, drugs, even AI, it's possible someone with his obsessions might try to manipulate the brain or create some kind of artificial companion that would, fulfill those dark desires.
It just goes to show that as technology progresses, so do the ways it can be abused. Makes ethical considerations in science even more important. We have to safeguard against those who might use it for harmful purposes.
It's a cautionary tale. Even in this day and age, the capacity for darkness is still there. We need to be vigilant, ethically aware, and committed to protecting the vulnerable now more than ever.
We've talked about the escalation of his crimes, this missed chances to stop him, the psychology behind it all. But there's still something missing, isn't there? How did he go undetected for so long? How could he do these things in an ordinary apartment building without anyone knowing?
It's a question that's baffled a lot of people. How could someone be so brazen, yet no one noticed?
Was it just about being careful, covering his tracks really well?
Being meticulous was definitely part of it. Dismembering bodies, disposing of them in different ways, using acid. He masked the smells, and he targeted victims who were less likely to be missed.
So he was calculated, organized, really trying hard to avoid detection. But it can't just be that, right? There must have been other things going on, too.
Of course. A big factor was the social context. A lot of his victims were young men of color, often from marginalized groups. Their disappearances didn't get the same attention as, say, white victims.
It's a sad truth about how our biases, conscious or not, can shape how we see and respond to crime.
Exactly. And it's not just race. He also went after people who were struggling with their sexuality, who might not report him because they were afraid of judgment or backlash.
So he was taking advantage of those who were already vulnerable, less likely to be taken seriously by the authorities. It's a heartbreaking reality.
And then there's his personality. He was described as quiet, unassuming, even polite. He blended in, seemed totally normal, which kept suspicion down.
Like a chameleon adapting to the situation. It's unsettling that someone so monstrous could be so good at deception.
Shows the complexity of human nature, the ability to compartmentalize things, hide darkness behind a normal facade. Evil can be anywhere, even in people who seem harmless.
We can't be complacent. We have to trust our instincts, speak up if something feels wrong.
Absolutely. Being aware of what's going on around us, challenging our own biases, and being willing to, step outside our comfort zones to keep others safe.
Dahmer getting away with it for so long, it wasn't just luck or him being smart. It was his planning, societal biases, and his manipulative personality. It's disturbing, but it's the truth, and we have to face it if we want to prevent these things from happening again.
We have to ask ourselves, what are the cracks in the system that let predators slip through? How can we be more aware of the signs? How can we build a society where everyone feels safe and valued, no matter their race, sexuality, or social standing?
It's been really heavy, going through all the details of Dahmer's crimes, trying to understand what could lead someone to do those things. But we need to shift focus now, talk about the aftermath, the impact all of this had on the victims and their families.
Yeah, absolutely. The devastation Dahmer caused, it's immeasurable. The families, not only did they lose loved ones, but there was no closure, no chance to say goodbye. And on top of that grief, the horrific way it happened and knowing their loved ones' disappearances weren't taken seriously.
It's true. A lot of the families reported them missing and were met with, indifference or skepticism. It shows how societal biases, especially about race and sexual orientation, can really affect how seriously missing persons cases are handled.
A lot of the families were from marginalized communities, and their pain, their pleas for help, were often ignored or downplayed. It's a failure of the system to protect those who are most vulnerable.
And it's infuriating. If those warnings had been taken seriously, if those biases hadn't been there, maybe some of those lives could have been saved.
Yeah, a harsh reminder that justice isn't always fair, and those inequalities, they can have devastating consequences.
But even with that unimaginable loss, the family showed incredible strength. They refused to be silenced. They demanded accountability and pushed for changes so this wouldn't happen again.
They took that grief and anger and turned it into action. Protests, sharing their stories, advocating for better ways to handle missing persons cases.
Their courage is remarkable. They took their pain and turned it into a force for change, a legacy that continues to inspire those fighting for justice and equality.
The Dahmer case really sparked a national conversation about how we handle these cases, especially for marginalized communities. It highlighted those consequences of prejudice and that we need to address those systemic biases in law enforcement.
And their efforts, they led to real changes, didn't they? Better communication between agencies, stronger protocols for missing persons, and greater awareness of the vulnerabilities those communities face.
But the impact goes way beyond just policy changes. Milwaukee was shaken to its core. The scars run deep.
Yeah, you can't even imagine the collective trauma, the fear and vulnerability that seeped into everyday life.
The Dahmer case, it ripped away that sense of safety. It showed the darkness that can be hiding anywhere. Made people face the fact that evil can exist even in their own neighborhoods.
And for those who lived nearby, saw him, maybe even talked to him, finding out what he was really like, must have been terrifying.
That sense of betrayal, realizing they were fooled by someone they thought was harmless, it's a big reminder that we can't judge a book by its cover. We have to be vigilant, protect ourselves and our communities.
The case also exposed those deep societal divisions about race, class, sexual orientation. It became this focal point for conversations about prejudice, discrimination, and how the system fails to protect the most vulnerable.
It forced people to acknowledge those uncomfortable truths about how bias affects our perceptions, how we react to crime, and who gets victimized.
It spurred activism, demands for justice, especially for marginalized communities, fueled the fight for LGBTQ rights and for fair treatment by law enforcement and the justice system.
The legacy of Dahmer's crimes, it's complex. It's a story of horror, of loss, but also of the strength of the human spirit, and a story of social change, of people coming together to fight injustice and build a better world.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm filled with sadness for the victims and their families, but also admiration for their strength and their fight for justice. It makes me want to work even harder to confront the darkness in the world.
Dahmer's story is definitely a warning. Evil can be anywhere, and we can't let our guard down. We have to be vigilant, protect the vulnerable. It's also a call to action, to examine our own biases, demand justice for everyone, and work towards a world where these tragedies don't happen.
This deep dive has been tough, but important. We've looked into the darkest parts of the human mind, faced some uncomfortable truths about our society, and seen incredible resilience in those affected by this tragedy.
And going forward, we have to carry those lessons with us. Remember the victims, honor them, and keep fighting for a just, compassionate world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Hopefully, by digging into this case, we've started a conversation, made people think, and inspired action. Because ultimately, the best way to honor the memory of those who suffered is to do everything we can to prevent these horrors from ever happening again.